The temperature in the grand hall held at a precise 68 degrees, but the chill that settled in my marrow had nothing to do with the climate control. I stood before the glass doors, watching Chicago vanish. The blizzard wasn't just weather. It was a white wall erasing the world, turning the streetlights into blurred, drowning stars. I adjusted my cuffs, a reflex of composure. This museum was my fortress, a sanctuary of order in a chaotic city. But tonight, the storm was testing the perimeter. The board of directors expected the retrospective to be flawless by morning. Failure was not an option. Yet, as the wind howled against the reinforced glass, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the reflection. I wasn't the only one left in the building. My life is a series of curated choices. What to keep, what to discard, what to illuminate, and what to leave in the dark. People think curation is about selecting beautiful things, but they are wrong. It is about control. It is about imposing a narrative on the messy, sprawling accident of history. I walked away from the doors, the click of my heels echoing in the cavernous silence. This silence was the most expensive commodity we owned. It smelled of floor wax and old varnish, a scent that usually calmed me. Tonight, however, the air felt thin, brittle, as if the storm outside was sucking the oxygen from the room. I moved through the West Wing, checking the humidity monitors. 45%. Perfect. I had spent 15 years building this reputation. The ice queen of the art world, the critics called me. They meant it as an insult, but I wore it like armor. Ice is clear. Ice is solid. Ice preserves. I ran a hand along the velvet rope cordoning off a Vermeer. My father had taught me that emotions were like humidity, unseen, pervasive, and capable of warping even the strongest foundations. So I rejected the messy, passionate artist I had been in my 20s, burying her under layers of theory. I remembered the smell of turpentine on my own hands decades ago, the way I used to sign my name with a flourish, before I learned that signatures were for artists. I had cut that part of me out, surgically, leaving only the critic behind. The board didn't pay for passion. They paid for prestige. They paid for the assurance that their investments would appreciate, that the gala would be tasteful, and that no scandal would ever touch the pristine walls of this institution. Tomorrow's walkthrough was critical. The chairman, a man who looked at oil paintings like they were stock certificates, had been hinting that the museum needed fresh blood. He meant someone younger, someone less rigid, someone who didn't treat the collection like a holy relic. I had to prove that my rigidity was the only thing holding this place together. I continued my rounds, the solitude usually a comfort. Tonight, it felt heavy. I paused in front of a blank space on the wall where the centerpiece of the new exhibition would hang. It was waiting for a masterpiece, something that would silence the whispers about my relevance. I had promised the board a revelation. I had nothing but empty wall space and a migraine tightening behind my eyes. The notification on my phone buzzed. Another weather alert. The city was shutting down, transit suspended, roads closing. I was trapped here. A logical part of my brain began calculating the logistics. Emergency generators, security protocols, food supplies in the staff lounge. But beneath the logic, a strange anxiety uncoiled. Being trapped meant losing the ability to leave, and I had always kept an exit strategy. I walked toward the restoration labs in the basement. The air grew cooler as I descended, the smell of chemicals and raw canvas replacing the polished scent of the galleries. This was the gut of the museum, the place where the illusion of perfection was manufactured. I rarely came down here after hours. It was too messy, too reminiscent of the studio I had abandoned years ago. I reached for the handle of the main lab door, expecting it to be locked, the lights off, the staff long gone to beat the snow. Instead, I saw a sliver of light bleeding out from underneath the doorframe. And then, a sound. Not the hum of the HVAC or the settling of the building. It was the rhythmic, scraping sound of a palette knife against canvas. Someone was working. Someone was violating the protocol of silence. My grip tightened on the cool metal of the handle. Unauthorized access, a breach of security, a variable I hadn't accounted for. I pushed the door open, ready to evict the intruder and restore my perfect, frozen order. The door swung open, not with a creak, but with a heavy, pressurized sigh that released a wave of heat and scent into the corridor. I stepped across the threshold and was immediately assaulted by the atmosphere. If the galleries upstairs were a vacuum, sterile, preserved, timeless, this room was a living organism. The air was thick, heavy with the sharp tang of turpentine, the earthy sweetness of linseed oil, and the underlying metallic bite of solvents. It smelled like labor. It smelled like the messy, chaotic act of creation that I had spent 2 decades forgetting. Jolene stood at the center of the room, bent over a large work table, bathed in the harsh, clinical glow of a magnifying lamp. She didn't look up when I entered. She didn't flinch. Her hand, holding a palette knife with the delicacy of a surgeon, moved in a small, rhythmic arc against the canvas. I stood there for a moment, just watching, letting my indignation build a structure around the surprise. I knew her file, of course. Jolene, senior restoration technician, highly recommended for her technical skill, noted for her disregard of administrative timetables. Seeing her now, the file felt inadequate. She was a riot of texture in my monochrome world. She wore a heavy, oversized knit sweater that had likely been gray once, but was now a map of her profession, smeared with ochre, burnt sienna, and a streak of vibrant cobalt blue near the hem. Her hair was pulled back in a haphazard knot, secured with what looked like a paintbrush handle, and loose strands fell across her forehead, defying gravity and order. "The museum is closed," I said. My voice was practiced, cool, authoritative, the voice that made donors sign checks and interns weep. "The security sweep was 20 minutes ago. You are violating protocol." Jolene didn't stop working. She didn't even stiffen. She simply finished her stroke, a microscopic adjustment of pigment, and then slowly wiped the blade on a rag that hung from her belt. Only then did she straighten up and turn to face me. "The adhesive needs to set," she said. Her voice was different from mine. It wasn't projected. It was grounded, resonant, like she was speaking from the center of her chest rather than her throat. "If I stop now, the bond fails, the paint flakes, the sky falls." She looked at me, and I felt a sudden, irritating prickle of awareness. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by the tailored lines of my suit or the title on my office door. She looked at me not as the eminent curator, but as a distraction in her peripheral vision. "You have a schedule," I countered, stepping further into the room, my heels clicking sharply on the concrete floor. "You have a shift, and you have a board of directors arriving in 8 hours who would be appalled to find unauthorized personnel lurking in the basement like a phantom." "The board cares about the asset," Jolene said, turning back to the canvas. "I care about the paint. The humidity upstairs is dropping. I can feel it in the floorboards. This canvas is from 1890. It's reacting to the pressure drop outside. If I leave it, it cracks. You want a cracked asset for your retrospective?" I walked up to the table, intending to dress her down for her insolence, but my eyes landed on the work she was saving. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a minor pastoral landscape, a study of a valley, something we kept in storage for rotation. It was worth perhaps $10,000, a rounding error in our insurance policy. Yet she was treating it with the reverence one would accord a Rembrandt. "It's a minor work," I said dismissively. "It's not worth the overtime, and it certainly isn't worth tripping the security alarms." "It's not minor to the guy who painted it," she murmured, leaning in close to the surface again. "And the light in the valley. Look at the glazing. He got it right. He captured the cold." I watched her hands. They were strong, scarred with small nicks and stained with ink and oil. They were capable hands. In contrast, my own hands were manicured, lotion soft, designed for holding champagne flutes and laser pointers. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to hide them behind my back. "I am the curator of this institution," I stated, my voice hardening, trying to regain the high ground. "I determine what is worth saving, and right now, I am determining that you need to pack up. The storm is worsening. If the power fluctuates..." I never finished the sentence. The hum of the ventilation system, a sound so constant I had ceased to hear it, cut out instantly. The harsh fluorescent lights above us flickered once, a violent strobe of white, and then died. The darkness was absolute, instantaneous, and heavy. The silence that followed wasn't the curated silence of the gallery. It was the dead, suffocating silence of a tomb. We were 200 feet underground, sealed in concrete, and the world had just turned off. The darkness lasted for 3 heartbeats, long enough for the illusion of my control to completely dissolve, before the emergency system kicked in. It didn't bring back the sterile, comforting white light of the gallery. Instead, the room was bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing wash of strobe red. The shadows jumped and receded with every flash, turning the restoration lab into something subterranean and primal. Then came the sound, a heavy, mechanical thud, 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 echoing through the ventilation shafts. "Perimeter locks," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The system detected a grid failure. It's sealing the building." "We're locked in," Jolene said. She didn't sound frightened. She sounded annoyed. She clicked a small flashlight on, the beam cutting through the red haze like a scalpel. "And the main air handlers just died. Can you hear that?" I listened. The deep, subsonic hum of the climate control, the heartbeat of the museum, was gone. In its place was a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. "The climate control," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "The humidity stabilizers, the temperature regulation. It's all off. Generators are for security and emergency lighting only," Jolene said, moving toward the back of the room where the breaker panels were housed. "They don't have the juice to run the HVAC. The building is going to equalize with the outside temperature within hours." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. It wasn't fear for my safety. I was wearing cashmere. I would survive. It was fear for the retrospective. Upstairs, in the main gallery, were 3 unglazed oil paintings on loan from the Rijksmuseum. They were sensitive to within 2 degrees of fluctuation. If the temperature plummeted, the canvas would contract, the paint would craze, the varnish would bloom. I saw the headline in the art newspaper before it was even written. "Curator presides over destruction of masterpieces." The board would not see a blizzard. They would see negligence. They would see a woman who couldn't keep the weather out. "We have to manually override the system," I said, my voice rising, fighting the silence. "We need to divert power from the security grid to the climate control in the West Wing." "Can't be done," Jolene said, not looking up from the panel she was inspecting. "The systems are hardwired separate. Fire code." "Do you know who sits on the board?" I snapped, stepping toward her, needing to transfer my anxiety onto someone else. "Julian Thorne. He thinks preservation is a matter of will. If those canvases warp, my career is over. We have to do something." Jolene turned the flashlight on me. The beam blinded me for a second, forcing me to look away, stripping me of my glare. "Your career can wait. Physics won't," she said. "This building is glass and concrete. It's a heat sink. It's 5 degrees below zero outside. The upper galleries are already lost. They're going to freeze. There is nothing you or I or Julian Thorne can do about that." I stood frozen, the red light pulsing over us. For 15 years, I had navigated museum politics, outmaneuvered rivals, and charmed donors. But here, in the dark, my currency was worthless. I didn't know how the vents connected. I didn't know the amperage of the generators. Jolene, however, was in her element. She moved with a fluid, practical economy. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was adapting to it. "We can't heat the museum," she said, her voice softening slightly as she saw the genuine terror on my face. "But we can seal this room. It's internal, no windows, insulated walls. If we block the intake vents, we can trap the residual heat. It's enough to keep the valley study safe. And us." "The valley?" I repeated, incredulous. "I am talking about millions of dollars of inventory upstairs, and you are worried about a rejected study?" "We save what we can touch," she said firmly. She grabbed a roll of heavy plastic sheeting and a roll of duct tape from a shelf. She shoved them into my chest. I caught them by reflex. "You want to be useful, curator? Help me seal the door vents. Unless you want to freeze to death in the dark while worrying about your reputation." I looked at the plastic in my hands. It was undignified. It was manual labor. It was an admission that the grand institution was failing. But as the temperature in the room began to noticeably drop, nipping at my exposed skin, the abstract fear of the board was replaced by the immediate, biting reality of the cold. "Show me," I said, the command coming out more like a plea. We worked in the strobe-lit dark. I, the eminent curator, taped plastic over heavy industrial vents, while the woman I had intended to reprimand directed the operation. We were shrinking the world down to this one room, retreating from the fortress to the bunker. And as the last piece of tape went up, sealing us in, the silence of the museum was replaced by the low, intimate thrum of the portable generator Jolene had kicked to life. It was a small sound, but in the vast, freezing dark, it was the only heartbeat left. The restoration lab had become a capsule, suspended in the freezing dark. The only light came from the battery-operated lantern Jolene had set on the workbench, casting long architectural shadows. The red emergency strobes were gone, leaving us in a pool of warm, yellow illumination. The portable heater hummed in the corner, smelling of burning dust and hot metal. I stood by it, rubbing my arms. Jolene, however, was in motion. She was moving the study of a valley closer to the heat source, treating the canvas with a tenderness that made my chest ache with a sudden, inexplicable jealousy. Not of her, but of the object receiving such focused, unadulterated care. "We need to stabilize the ambient temp around the easel," she said, her back to me. She was shifting a heavy wooden work table to create a windbreak against the door, just in case a draft slipped through. "Grab the other end." I hesitated. Manual labor was not in my job description. My hands were insured for their signature, not their grip strength. But the cold was a great equalizer, and the look she threw over her shoulder, impatience mixed with a challenge, propelled me forward. I gripped the rough, splintered edge of the oak table. "On 3, I said, my voice sounding tinny in the enclosed space. "Just lift," she countered. We heaved the table across the concrete floor. It was heavy, dead weight, and the exertion forced a sharp intake of breath from my lungs. We set it down with a thud that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. In the narrow space between the table and the easel, there was nowhere to retreat. I was suddenly standing inches from her. I could smell the rain that had dried on her clothes hours ago, the faint chemical sweetness of turpentine, and beneath that, the warm, living scent of her skin. It was a shock to the system. For years, I had kept people at a distance, measured in desk widths and velvet ropes. Now, the heat radiating from her body was the most tangible thing in the room. "You're shivering," she observed. She wasn't looking at my face. She was looking at my hands, which were clenched white against the dark wood of the table. "I'm fine," I lied, the reflex of the curator dying hard. "It's just the adrenaline." "It's 30 degrees in the hallway," she said dryly. She reached out, presumably to check the latch on the easel behind me, but in the cramped quarters, her arm brushed against mine. The contact was electric. Not in the poetic sense, but in the literal, physical snap of static generated by the dry air and wool. A spark jumped between us, audible and sharp. I flinched, pulling back as if burned. Jolene didn't pull back. She froze, her arm hovering in the space where mine had been, her eyes locking onto mine with a sudden, intense curiosity. "Static," I murmured, feeling a flush rise up my neck that had nothing to do with the heater. "The air is too dry." "It's charged," she corrected, her voice dropping an octave. She didn't move away. The distance between us remained collapsed, a violation of every protocol I held dear, yet I found my feet refusing to step back. "Why are you really down here, curator? You could be in your office with the emergency scotch and a blanket." "I told you," I said, trying to summon my boardroom voice and failing. It came out breathless. "I was doing rounds." "You were hiding," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a diagnosis. She leaned back against the work table, crossing her arms, the heavy knit of her sweater stretching over her shoulders. "You were hiding from the storm, or the board, or the silence upstairs. And now you're stuck in a box with a technician and a painting nobody wants." "I am responsible for every square inch of this institution," I defended, though the words felt hollow. I looked at the painting she had saved, the humble valley, the gray sky, the thick impasto strokes of white snow. It was a nothing painting, a reject. And yet, watching her defend it against the cold, I felt a crack in my own veneer. "Why this one?" I asked, deflecting. "Why risk your job for a study?" "Because it's honest," Jolene said, her gaze drifting to the canvas, then snapping back to me, heavy and unflinching. The artist wasn't trying to impress anyone. They were just trying to capture the cold before it killed them. You can feel the desperation in the brushwork. It has a texture. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if I were a canvas she was assessing for damage. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the heater and the sound of our breathing. The air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken questions and the sudden, terrifying realization that in this small, warm room, my title meant nothing, and her proximity meant everything. The cold was outside, but the danger, the real danger, was right here, standing in front of me with paint on her hands. The physics of the room began to shift. What had been a sanctuary against the cold was rapidly becoming a kiln. The industrial heater, efficient and relentless, churned out dry, thick heat that pooled in the small, sealed space. The air grew heavy, losing its crisp, wintry edge, and taking on a humidity that felt almost tropical against the concrete. I felt a bead of perspiration trace a slow, deliberate line down my spine, a violation of my composure that I couldn't correct. Jolene felt it too. She paused in her work, the palette knife hovering over the canvas. She rolled her neck, a fluid, unselfconscious movement that drew my eyes to the line of her throat. Without asking for permission, without even glancing at me, she set the tool down and reached for the hem of her heavy, paint-stained sweater. "It's too hot," she murmured. I should have looked away. Professional courtesy dictated I turn my back while a subordinate adjusted her clothing. But the room was too small, the intimacy too forced, and my own curiosity too aroused. I watched as she pulled the thick wool over her head, her hair static clinging to the fibers before falling back in a chaotic halo around her face. Underneath, she wore a simple ribbed tank top, the kind of garment that belonged in a studio, not a museum. It exposed her arms, the skin dusted with a faint shimmer of sweat. But it wasn't the muscle that stopped my breath. It was the ink. It was a signature. Specifically, it was my signature. Not the tight, legible script I use now, but the mark I had used 20 years ago. The signature of the artist I had murdered to become the curator. "Where did you get that?" My voice was barely a whisper. Jolene turned her wrist outward, offering the ink to the light. "I think you know." "That is a forgery," I snapped, panic rising. "That is a private mark, from a very brief, insignificant period." "It's not a forgery if it's a tribute," Jolene countered. "Berlin, 2004. The Glass Hunger series. You painted on raw linen. You used industrial solvents to strip the oil back until the image looked like a wound." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had destroyed those canvases before I took my first internship. I had erased that girl. "I destroyed those," I said, my voice trembling. "One survived," Jolene said. "A collector in Kreuzberg has it. I saw it when I was studying restoration in Europe. I stood in front of it for 3 hours. I'd never seen anything so angry, so unflinching." She looked down at her arm, tracing the black lines with her thumb. I got this the next day, to remind me that art isn't just about preservation. It's about risk. The woman who painted that, she wasn't afraid of anything. She was a mess, I hissed, stepping forward, invading her space. I needed to see it closer. I needed to prove it was a mistake. She was chaotic. She was undisciplined. "She was brilliant," Jolene corrected, her voice dropping to a hush that vibrated in the small room. I reached out. I couldn't stop myself. My hand, usually so steady, trembled as my fingers hovered over her skin. I touched the tattoo. Her skin was hot, fever hot, damp and alive. The texture of the ink was indistinguishable from the texture of her flesh, but the psychological weight of it was crushing. I was touching my own past, etched permanently into the body of the woman who was currently dismantling my future. "You knew," I whispered, my fingers tracing the sharp V of the signature. "You've been working for me for 2 years. You knew who I was. You knew I was her." "I knew who you were," Jolene said, and her gaze lifted to mine, locking us together in the dim light. I've been waiting to see if she was still in there somewhere, under the suits, under the ice. The air seemed to snap. My finger was still on her arm, resting on her pulse point. I could feel her heart beating under my touch. I was the curator, the observer, never the observed. But here, with my name written on her skin, I was devastatingly exposed. The board, the blizzard, the reputation, it all fell away. There was only the realization that this woman saw me more clearly than I had seen myself in decades. My hand remained on her arm, a trespasser on her skin. I should have pulled back. I should have retreated to the safety of my title, invoked the HR handbook, and demanded she cover herself. But the shock had severed the wiring of my professional restraint. I was grounded there, my fingertips reading the braille of my own lost history on the inside of her wrist. The heat of her body was a radiant physical weight that made the cold outside feel like a distant rumor. "You studied it," I said, the words feeling thick in my mouth. "You didn't just see it, you studied it." "I memorized it," Jolene corrected. Her voice was low, devoid of the deference she usually offered me in the corridors. In this bunker, stripped of the museum's hierarchy, she was simply another artist, and I was the subject. The brushwork wasn't careful. It was violent. You didn't paint that series to be hung in a gallery. You painted it to get something out of your blood. She looked down at where my hand still rested on her ink. "That's why I kept it. To remind myself that you don't have to be polite to be true. I look at you upstairs, walking the halls in those structured suits, talking about provenance and market stability, and I wonder, does she remember what it feels like to burn?" The question hung in the humid air, heavier than the silence. I pulled my hand back then, clutching it to my chest as if I had been scorched. The accusation hit its mark with terrifying precision. I had spent 2 decades curating a life that was safe. I had traded the burn for the freeze. "I grew up," I said, my voice sharp, defensive. "I learned that raw emotion doesn't pay the electric bill. It doesn't preserve history. It consumes it. That girl in Berlin, she would have burned this museum down just to see the colors in the smoke." "Maybe it needs burning," Jolene murmured. She pushed off the table, taking a step toward me. The space between us, already compromised, evaporated. Maybe the board needs to see something that isn't perfectly preserved. Maybe they need to see something that bleeds. I looked at her, really looked at her. In the dim, amber light of the lantern, she was a study in contrasts, shadow and illumination, softness and grit. The smell of turpentine on her clothes was intoxicating, a sensory trigger that brought the memories of my old studio rushing back, the late nights, the stained fingers, the desperate, unthinking need to create. I felt flayed open. My armor, the carefully constructed persona of the Eminent Curator, lay in shards on the concrete floor. "I didn't destroy them because they were bad," I whispered, the confession tearing itself from my throat before I could stop it. "I destroyed them because they were too much. I couldn't live at that pitch. It was unsustainable." "Vulnerability always is," she said. Her gaze was unflinching, holding mine with a gravity that made my knees weak. "But it's the only thing that's real. Everything upstairs, the Vermeers, the sculptures, the gala preparations, it's all theater. This," she gestured to the small, cluttered room, the humming heater, the rejected canvas drying on the easel. "This is the work. This is the mess." The tension deepened, becoming sultry and slow. I could hear the catch in her breath, see the dilation of her pupils. The way she looked at me was a look of recognition, a hunger that mirrored the one I had buried. "I miss it," I admitted, the words barely audible over the hum of the generator. "I miss the mess. I miss the feeling of not knowing what happens next." "You don't have to know," Jolene said softly. She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between us, an invitation and a challenge. "You just have to let the paint dry." The distance closed. It wasn't a decision I made. It was a surrender to a magnetic pull that had been building since I walked through the door. I stepped into her orbit, drawn by the heat, by the ink on her skin, and by the terrifying, exhilarating realization that for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't in control. And I didn't want to be. The space between us was measured in the ragged rhythm of our breathing. My hand was still resting on her forearm, my fingertips tracing the black ink that she had carried like a secret for years. "You kept it," I whispered, the realization still settling heavy in my chest. "All this time. You walked past me in the corridors, you sat in the back of staff meetings, and you had this on your skin." "I told you," Jolene said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards. "I don't throw things away just because they're messy. That's your department. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her arm slightly, pressing her wrist into my palm. A deliberate, tactile invitation that sent a shockwave up my spine. The texture of her skin was a revelation. Rough from work, warm from the heater, and terrifyingly alive. It was so different from the cold, polished marble I spent my days preserving. This was flesh and blood and heat. "I'm not that artist anymore," I said, though the protest felt weak, dissolving in the humid air of the lab. "I'm the curator. I build walls. I don't paint on them." "You're building a wall right now," Jolene observed. She took a step closer, invading the last sanctuary of my personal space. The smell of her, turpentine, rain, and a subtle, musky warmth, filled my senses, drowning out the sterile scent of the museum. "You're trying to categorize this. You're trying to figure out where to hang this moment in the exhibit of your life so it doesn't disrupt the narrative. Stop curating, Elena. Just be here." Her use of my first name, stripped of any title, was the final fracture in the glass. I looked up at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a subordinate. I saw a woman who looked at me with an intensity that was both terrifying and undeniably sultry. Her gaze was a slow, deliberate read of my intentions, scanning me not for flaws, but for the truth I had buried. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted, my voice trembling. The vulnerability was raw, a sensation I usually suppressed with paperwork and protocol. If I stop controlling it, everything collapses. "Let it collapse," she murmured. She reached out, her hand moving with the slow, confident precision of someone who knew exactly how to handle delicate things. Her fingers grazed my jawline, a touch so light it felt like a phantom, yet it burned. She wasn't asking for permission. She was acknowledging a reality that had already been established. "You have paint on your face," I whispered, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to cling to observation rather than participation. There was a smudge of cerulean blue near her temple, a vibrant mark of her labor. "And you," she said softly, her thumb brushing over my lower lip, "have been holding your breath for a decade." The distance closed. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic collision. It was a gravitational inevitability. I leaned into her touch, my eyes fluttering shut as the control I prized so dearly finally snapped. When she kissed me, it wasn't tentative. There was no hesitation, no polite testing of the waters. It was unflinching. It was a kiss that tasted of patience and long-suppressed hunger, a claiming that went deeper than the skin. Her mouth was warm and firm, moving against mine with a slow, devastating rhythm that dismantled my defenses brick by brick. I made a sound, a low, fractured noise that I didn't recognize as my own, and gripped her arms, my fingers digging into the wool of the sweater she held, needing an anchor. The world of the museum, the board, the blizzard, it all dissolved into white noise. There was only the heat of the lab, the hum of the generator, and the overwhelming sensory reality of her. She pulled me closer, her arm winding around my waist, pulling me flush against her body. The contact was a shock of solid heat. I felt the strength in her frame, the capability that I had dismissed as mere labor, now supporting me as my knees threatened to buckle. I felt the precise texture of her intention in the kiss. She wasn't just kissing the curator. She was kissing the woman who had once painted with fire and blood. My hands moved of their own accord, sliding up her arms to tangle in the messy knot of her hair, pulling her deeper. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without words, a desperate, sultry exchange of oxygen and need. I tasted the coffee she'd had hours ago, the salt of my own panic, and the undeniable sweetness of release. I wasn't watching from behind a velvet rope. I was the art. I was the mess. And as Jolene's hand pressed against the small of my back, I realized that the collapse I had feared wasn't a destruction. It was a restoration. The ice was melting. In the dark, heated center of the earth, I was finally awake. The morning didn't break. It shattered. It arrived not with sunlight, but with the jarring mechanical scrape of a plow blade hitting asphalt 3 stories above us. The sound vibrated through the concrete foundations, a violent reminder that the world had not ended, only paused. In the basement, the generator sputtered, its fuel finally running low. causing the single lantern to flicker and dim. The sudden shift in light woke me from a doze I hadn't realized I'd fallen into. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the leg of the heavy work table, my shoulder pressed solidly against Jolene's. For a moment, a suspended, breathless second, I stayed there. I let myself feel the warmth of her arm, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the absolute reality of the night we had just survived. The restoration lab felt like a capsule, a separate timeline where I was allowed to be messy, tired, and touched. But then, the vibration of the plow came again, louder this time, followed by the piercing electronic chirp of my phone. The screen lit up the semi-darkness with a harsh blue glare. Service restored. Then, a flood of notifications cascaded down the glass. Missed calls from the security firm, frantic emails from the facility manager, and 3 voicemails from the chairman of the board. "The siege is over," Jolene said. Her voice was rough with sleep, but clear. She didn't scramble away or try to fix her hair. She simply stretched, the movement fluid and unhurried, and looked at the phone glowing in my hand. "Duty calls." "The board," I said, the word tasting like iron. "They're coming. Julian Thorne is already en route. He wants a damage assessment before the press gets wind of the power failure." I stood up, and the physical separation from her felt like peeling off a layer of skin. My suit was wrinkled, my hair was a disaster, and I smelled of turpentine and sweat. I was not the Eminent Curator. I was a woman who had spent the night on a concrete floor. I reached for my blazer, instinctively trying to smooth out the creases, trying to reconstruct the armor. "The Valley study is stable," Jolene said, standing up and checking the canvas on the easel. She ignored my frantic grooming. "The bonding agent held. It's ready." "Leave it," I said, my voice rising in panic. "We need to get upstairs. If Thorne finds us down here—" "If he finds us, he finds us," she interrupted, her gaze unflinching. She picked up the small canvas. "I'm not leaving it. It's the only thing in this building that didn't freeze last night." We ascended the stairs in silence. As we pushed open the door to the main level, the cold hit us like a physical blow. The grand hall was a mausoleum of ice. The air was frigid, visible in white puffs as we breathed. Frost had furned across the inside of the massive glass doors, obscuring the blinding white glare of the snow-covered city outside. The silence here was different from the basement. It was sharp, brittle, and expensive. And standing in the center of that frozen expanse was the board. They had arrived early, bypassing security with their master keys. Julian Thorne stood flanked by 2 other board members, looking like a tribunal of winter gods in their pristine cashmere overcoats and leather gloves. They were inspecting a sculpture, their breath misting in the air, their expressions grim. When we emerged from the stairwell, me, disheveled and pale, Jolene, carrying a painting and wearing her paint-stained sweater, they turned as one. The silence that stretched across the polished concrete floor was agonizing. Thorne's eyes swept over me, taking in the wrinkles, the lack of makeup, the sheer humanity of my appearance. His lip curled slightly, a microscopic expression of distaste. Then his gaze slid to Jolene. It didn't linger. It dismissed her entirely, categorizing her as staff, as mess, as something that didn't belong in the frame. "Curator," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cold, echoing in the cavernous hall. "We expected a disaster report, not this. The climate control systems failed, the humidity levels are critical, and yet I find you emerging from the basement with," he gestured vaguely at Jolene, "unauthorized personnel." "We were securing the assets," I said. The lie felt thin. My voice lacked its usual resonance. I felt small under his gaze, the old reflex to please, to perfect, to curate, rising up in my throat. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to explain that it wasn't what it looked like, that I was still the Ice Queen, that I hadn't melted. Securing assets? Thorne stepped closer, peering at the canvas in Jolene's hands. He didn't look at her face, only at the object she held. "You prioritized a minor study? A reject from the intake room? While the Vermeers were exposed to sub-zero temperatures?" "The Vermeers are behind thermal glass," Jolene said. Her voice cut through the tension, grounded and calm. She didn't address him as a superior. She spoke a fact. "They're fine. This one wasn't protected, so we saved it." Thorne scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. We pay you to restore masterpieces, not to play hero with garbage. Put that down and leave. The curator and I have a career to discuss. If there is one left to discuss. He looked at me then, expecting agreement, expecting the eminent curator to step forward, dismiss the technician, and align herself with the power, the money, and the order. I felt the pull of it, the safety of the script I had followed for 20 years. I could fix this. I could blame the storm, blame Jolene, smooth the edges, and step back into the ice. All I had to do was look away from her. All I had to do was agree that the night in the basement was a mistake, an anomaly, a mess to be cleaned up. But then I looked at Jolene's hands. They were gripping the frame of the painting, white-knuckled but steady. The ink of my signature on her arm was hidden by her sleeve, but I could feel its weight from across the room. She wasn't looking at Thorne. She was looking at me. And she wasn't waiting for me to save her. She was waiting to see if I was brave enough to save myself. The silence in the grand hall was a physical weight, heavier than the snow piling up against the glass doors. Julian Thorne waited for my apology. He waited for the retreat. He expected the curator to perform her function, to smooth the edges, to bury the mistake, to freeze the world back into a perfect, manageable shape. But I looked at him, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't see a kingmaker. I saw a man in a coat that cost more than my first studio, shivering because he didn't know how to generate his own heat. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it shattered the expectation in the room like a hammer hitting crystal. Julian blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but I didn't give him the space to speak. We are not discarding it, I said, my voice gaining volume, resonating off the high ceilings. I took a step toward Jolene, aligning myself with her, with the mess, with the paint, with the unauthorized life she represented. And you are not dismissing her. Excuse me? Julian's voice dropped to a dangerous register. I think the lack of oxygen has confused you. This is a business, not a charity ward for amateur sketches. It is a museum, I corrected, reaching out to take the canvas from Jolene. Our fingers brushed, a spark of static and memory that grounded me instantly. I held the painting up, turning it so the board could see the frantic, desperate brushwork of the valley snow. And this is not an amateur sketch. It is a record of survival. It captures the exact moment the light fails. It is honest. And honesty is the only asset we have left. I walked past him, my heels clicking on the concrete. Not with the frantic pace of anxiety, but with the measured stride of someone who owns the floor. I walked to the empty wall, the space I had feared the night before. The retrospective is canceled, I announced, turning back to face them. We aren't showing the perfection of the past. We are showing the cost of it. This canvas is the centerpiece. You're ending your career, one of the other board members muttered, looking scandalized. I'm starting it, I replied. I looked at Jolene. She was watching me, her lips curved in a small, knowing smile, her eyes dark and proud. She wasn't surprised. She had seen the ink on my arm. She knew this fire was there, waiting for a draft to catch. Jolene isn't unauthorized personnel. She is the only person in this building who understood the assignment. She saved the art while we worried about the insurance. Julian stared at me. He looked at the painting, then at the fierce, undeniable connection between the curator and the technician. He was a businessman. He knew when a merger was hostile, and he knew when he had lost the controlling share. He saw the steel in my spine, forged in the basement dark. The exhibition of the thaw, I said, giving it a name right there in the cold. That's the show. If you want a resignation, you can have it. But if you want a legacy, you'll let us hang this. He didn't fire me. He couldn't. The conviction in my voice was a currency he couldn't devalue. He simply adjusted his gloves, nodded once, a curt, terrified acknowledgement of something he didn't understand, and turned to leave. By the time the gala opened 2 weeks later, the snow had melted, but the heat remained. The critics stood in front of the small, rough landscape, baffled and mesmerized. They whispered about the bold, new direction. They didn't know I hadn't curated the show for them. I had curated it for the woman standing in the shadows of the portico, wearing a dress that showed the ink on her arms, watching me with a gaze that stripped the room bare. The crowd thinned, leaving us alone in the gallery's warm hum. I didn't look at the masterpiece on the wall. I looked at her. The distance was gone, replaced by a permanent gravitational pull. I reached out, interlacing my fingers with hers, feeling the rough, beautiful reality of her skin against mine. The ice hadn't just cracked, it had evaporated. If you want to feel the burn of a story that refuses to freeze, subscribe.